And without wasting any time, let us welcome our honorable panelists for our first symposium. Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, our Senior Advisor at the Kazanah Research Institute. Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid, a Research Fellow at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies. Dr. Nungsari Ahmad Radhi, a well-known Malaysian economist. And our moderator for our first symposium, Dr. Evelyn Shyamala Anak Perempuan Paul Devadasan, a professor at the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya. The title for our first symposium is Malaysia in the Next Decade. Are we on the right track? Now we would like to pass the floor to them. Please welcome our honorable panelists and moderator.
Yeah, thank you, MUEC. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on Malaysia in the next decade. Are we on the right track? Now, the goal of this decade is to deliberate policies, basically current and future solutions or future policies, to review existing policies, to identify what worked and what did not, and what needs to be done in the next decade. For this, we will look at the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030, which actually charters the direction for the country in terms of ensuring there is sustainable development along the lines of fair, equitable, and inclusive principles. In this regard, we have three distinguished panelists. Allow me to introduce them, who will provide their expert views on some important questions, one of which is we are all concerned with the current small fiscal space. So the first question would be, can Malaysia achieve SPV in the next, or in the remaining 9 years? The second question is, long-term economic planning still relevant in an era of constant disruption? The third question is, has Malaysia been more inclusive in its policy formulation? And the final question, has sustainable economic development been well articulated in the current economic policies? For this, we have three speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid. Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid is currently a research fellow at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, IKMAS, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, or MIER. Our second speaker is Dr. Nungsari Ahmad Radhi. Dr. Nungsari is an economist, and he has held previous positions in academia and has been actively engaged in various roles in corporate advisory, economic research, and policy advocacy. And our final speaker for the day is Prof. Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Prof. Jomo is a prominent economist, both local and international. He is a senior advisor. He's a senior advisor at the Kazanah Research Institute, visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and adjunct professor at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Now, the three speakers will be given 15 minutes each to deliberate on any of the four questions posed deemed suitable. And you can fit in your conversation and your views. After each speaker has spoken for about 15 minutes each, we'll take on Q&A from all participants. So participants, keep posting your questions online during the session, and we will compile those questions and post them to the speakers. For now, we'll start with the hearing the views of the three speakers. Can I please call upon Dr. Muhammad to present his views? Thank you, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you, everyone. Allow me to, thanks for the invitation. Allow me to be frank and honest so that I can be useful to the students and to the listeners. To answer your question, the title of our talk today, are we on the right track? On the right track towards what? If it's on the right track towards high income country, Probably yes. Are we on the right track towards inclusive society where everybody benefits and there's upward mobility, especially among the vulnerable? The answer is no. In fact, the train towards inclusive dah nak terbalik dah pun. Dah nak tergelincir. Why do I say that? Towards high income, yes, in terms, while economy has contracted a bit, even though that this year we grow by 4%, because of COVID. In fact, our size of the economy as of end 2018, 2019. So we lost about 2 years. But to reach high income, probably towards the end of this decade. But it's not gonna be the same for all the states, because GDP per capita for certain states, because of COVID, has been pushed back. For Terengganu and Pahang, the GDP per capita right now is the same as in the year 2016, 2017. For Sabah, 2017. So it's 4 and 5 years back for certain states. It's not the same. So even though country can go high income, but not all states going to be do better. And I have to caution that high income doesn't mean that everybody is rich. High income doesn't mean that you're a developed country. Saudi Arabia, in terms of high income, is richer than Korea. You want to be Saudi Arabia, you want to be Korea. Qatar richer than Germany, rather be Germany than be in Qatar. What you want is a developed country, an inclusive country. And towards inclusiveness, it's going to be very challenging, because before COVID, it's already challenging. Before COVID, if you look at poverty in terms of relative, it did not, between 2016 to 2019, actually it went up. It did not come down. Relative poverty, the country grew, it's much richer, but the poverty level in terms of relative went up. Inequality also went up. The first time since 2004, inequality went up. With income growth, usually since 1970, the income growth that accrued to B40 is always higher than M40 and T20. The first time ever happened is between the 2016-2019, where the income growth of T20 is higher than B40. That's why you have inequality grows up. This is before COVID. We have youth unemployment issue before COVID. We have stunting level of among our children. I like to look at, if you want to look at one indicator, either the country is doing well or not, you always look at how the most vulnerable perform. And children are the most vulnerable. They cannot protect themselves. And if you look at the status of our children, I like this figure very much, the stunting level of our children is quite embarrassing. It should be a national crisis. Globally, the level of stunting has been going down, but in Malaysia, it's been going up. In fact, the level of stunting among our kids now is the same as in 1999. No progress over 2 decades. And of course, elderly. Elderly now, before COVID, 4 in 10 live in relative poverty. This is before COVID. So we already have a challenge in terms of inclusiveness before COVID. And COVID make it worse. Why I say make it worse? Economy not doing well, a lot of companies closed. Unemployment grew up by 41%. Underemployed grew up by 82% last year. And it has impact. And the impact is this. Poverty level went up. It never went up from 5.6 to 8.4 last year. What does it mean? An increase of 200,000 households. If one household B40 have 5 children, for instance, 5 members, that's additional 1 million Malaysian in poverty. Inequality, like I mentioned, before COVID is already increased. COVID make it worse. Why? Those who lost the job are mostly those in B40, those in self-employment, and those with lower educational attainment. You will see the impact towards them is much worse. They're much worse impacted than the other group. So you will see inequality also goes up. And when you look at the wages, Department of Statistics reduced the wages figures recently. Malaysia overall dropped by 10% last year. But among those who have lower educational attainment, the wages dropped by 18%. Those with higher educational attainment dropped by 10%. So they already lose their job, and in terms of those who have their job, wage growth is much affected than other groups. So you can expect the inequality will go up, but in the long run, it's going to be much worse. Why? Because usually education is an important factor towards a ladder towards upward mobility. Education has always been a key factor. Now, especially among lower income kids, now education is no longer a leveler, a grade leveler. Because you see, Now those, because of education inequality, kids have to use this. Study that we did with UNICEF, kids in low-income families, 1 in 5 lost interest in study. So education not gonna be a good leveler anymore for kids to move up the ladder. So you're gonna have a very unequal society. And among the young now, who's gonna be a consumer a good quality human capital, we have a serious issue. Unemployment has gone up, but unemployment among the youth is 3 times the national average. And if I can slice the young, the audience here is the graduates, the young graduates. Last year, and there's an increase of 22% of those youth graduates. And the highest level are those with education with a degree, not with diploma. So those who are listening. And even if you're lucky enough to get a job, your wage actually has dropped so much. It's dropped by 1/4, by 25% last year. Now, if you enter the median wage for young graduate is 1,550. You're about 200 ringgit difference than minimum wage who doesn't require a graduate degree. And compared to the previous generation, now the young graduate has a debt to pay because of PTPTN, which means you have less money to spend to stimulate the economic growth. Insurance government gonna collect less for social assistance. So the young would get much affected. So either the current COVID would help us become more inclusive, develop. I'm less pessimistic. Can we address this? Of course we can. We can address this. The immediate objective of the government to ensure that no one fall through the cracks. So the government has to spend. The problem is we are not spending enough. We hear a lot, 530 billion, 540 billion, the largest in the dunia, the akhirat. Semua tu tipu. It's not true. We only spend about 84 billion. And this 84 billion is actually our money. Government has no money. They collect money through taxation, either from individual or through companies. And the government give back 84 billion. It's a very small amount. It's only about 6% of total economy. We spend more. Those who withdraw from EPF, 120 billion, much more than what the government spent. Loan moratorium, triple more than what the government spent. The government do not spend. And we hear earlier, I've been asked to ask about little fiscal space. I do not know who created this word, little fiscal space. There's no such thing. Little fiscal. It's better to spend so that people survive. It's better to spend that people get educated than not spend, people are dying and society become stupid. We can spend. Now, debt to GDP about 60%. Oh, tak boleh lah, tinggi lah. In 1980s, my friend, both of us, 3 of us, all from Penang, they would share perhaps. In 1980s, when we had the commodity crisis, debt to GDP is more than 100%. But within 10 years, we had a surplus. We reduced because spending to the rakyat is not spending per se. It's an investment. You give to the children, you get your return. You give to Makcik Kia, she would spend. She would spend. Dia kalau duduk flat, dia turun bawah, dia spend. Pakcik kedai itu dapat income, can employ people, pay tax. So the economy would expand. So we can spend because it is an investment. And without spending, we would become a very, very unequal society because those who be affected are the low income, very unequal society. And it is bad for Malaysia because we are multiracial. And you will see there's always going to be ethnic component. The subtext always ethnic component. You're going to be very in country where huge instability, not just in economy, social, but of course, like we see now, the political instability. So the kereta api itu bukan dah terbalik, dah meletup. So I'm quite pessimistic at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. You have provided some views and you're less pessimistic, I understand, on whether growth has been inclusive, citing signs of the economy such as disproportionate growth across states, rising inequality, poverty, and unemployment among the youth or graduates. With that, can we turn now to Dr. Nungsari? Dr. Nungsari, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you to the organizers, the students organizing this. Thank you for having me. I would like to start off by answering the big question: are we on the big track, like Dr. Muhammad?
We lost him. He
Yeah,
must
I
have
think
clicked the Live Studio by accident.
I think we just give a few minutes for him to come back. Yeah.
Or we can go to Prof. Jomo directly while waiting for Dr. Nung.
Should we maybe wait just 1 minute if Dr. Nungsari is not able to get back? Prof. Jomo, maybe we can start with you. Let's give and take 1 minute.
What I can also stop as soon as Dr. Nung comes back.
Really? Prof, would it be disruptive for you? Is that fine?
No. I'll be happy to do that because Dr. Nung seems to have a... Okay, here he is.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Dr. Nung.
I'm
We
not
got
very
you back.
stable. Sorry.
Okay, it's fine here.
No, I'm not very stable. No, my answer is still...
He's having problems with his connection. Maybe Prof. Jomo, we'll start with you and you can finish till the end. We'll bring back Dr. Nungsari as the third speaker. Is that fine, Prof? We'll let you go. He has written,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Evelyn, and thank you very much to the organizers for kindly inviting me to join you today. Allow me to begin with your second question on the shared prosperity vision. Frankly, I am not very persuaded by the desirability of the shared prosperity vision. Not that I don't want to share prosperity, but I think it is inadequate, especially for the times in which we live. And we have to recognize the very, very specific challenges, including the fact that COVID-19 is probably endemic, and we will have to live with COVID-19, and that we are already behind the curve, behind in many ways on so many fronts, even before the pandemic struck. So I would suggest that rather than think about whether or not we are on the right track, we may be on the right track, but going the wrong way. Okay, so it's not much point being on the right track for its own sake. Dr. Nung.
Hi. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, you go.
No. While we have you, we want to hear you.
It can be long enough. Let me get. Now, I wanted to say actually that we're not on the right track for two reasons. But the first reason has already been elaborated by Dr. Muhammad. I think we're not on the right track because I'm going to elaborate my first reason, which is the production, the structure, the economy itself is not on the right track, and the consequence of that is all these distributional issues that Dr. Muhammad has elaborated on: the inequality, the income, the loss of purchasing power, the fragility of a huge and growing number of poorer Malaysians. So that I would answer the question as we're not on the right track for that reason as well. But Dr. Muhammad has elaborated on that, so I won't say much more on those things. But we're not on the right track towards achieving, and I'm even disagreeing with Dr. Muhammad here that he said on the right track towards what? I'm even disagreeing with him that we're not even on the right track towards a high-income developed nation, mainly because the production structure, the nature of production, the nature of the economy that we've seen the last 2 decades or so is not moving in the right direction. I mean, first of all, we've not moved away or moved beyond the logic of a resource-based economy, which is mainly the plantation, and then this palm oil or or rubber, and then oil and gas. So largely, the economy is still very much that, and we've not moved beyond that. Plus a little bit that we've gotten on the manufacturing side, mainly from foreign direct investments. And what we have seen, especially since the Asian financial crisis in 1998, is that the level of investments as a share of the economy has been on the decline, which means that the productive capacity or new productive capacity of the economy has gone down. And the consequence of that is the kind of inequality that Muhammad alluded to. 1 in 4 jobs today that this engine has created are skilled jobs. 3 out of 4 jobs created by this engine are low skilled jobs, and hence it is creating, and it created this low income regime that we see, and the inequality. Of course, the top 10% who owns the capital and the financial assets see their income growing, but the lower 60% like that. I was counting the 2019 household income survey. The share of the bottom 60% is equivalent to the share of, in terms of income, of the top 10% of households. So that's the kind of disparity we see. But that is the result of the structure and nature of the economy that is not able to create the kinds of demand in the labor market that pays the right sort of jobs, the right sort of income. And it has to do with what firms do. And so what firms do is they do things, they have to be profitable, but they do things that only allows them to pay low and lower income jobs. So that is the structure of the economy. We are not short of capital because we are an economy that has always had surplus in the current account since after the 98 crisis. And so we have capital, right? So, but this capital is being mixed with labor in a way that doesn't create enough value that labor gets enough share out of this production value. Not to say that capital gets a lot relative to other countries, but capital get a lot more than labor in this country. But are we making the best of the capital that we have? No, we're not, because we're not doing new things, and that's why I think we are not on the right track, and therefore we don't see lots of investments or reinvestments, and that's why the economy slowly is domesticating over the last 20 years. So once the economy domesticates, you see the phenomena of the services sector growing, right? So now the services sector is about 55, almost 60% of the economy, and most of the services sector are domestic based, except for some that relies on tourism and so on. And yet at the same time, in terms of trade, we still suffer lots and lots of deficit on the trade side of the trading, on our trading account. The merchandise side is okay, but the services side is still in deficit. So the economy is not moving in the right direction, and it's translating into this inequality that Dr. Muhammad alluded to this low income, to the inability to create new jobs. But why is this happening? So I'm trying to go back to the chairperson's question. Despite having all these long-term, development plans, right? This is Malaysia plans, OPP1, OPP2, National Development Plan, National Vision Plan, and then now the Wawasan, the SPV 2030. So my hypothesis is actually the reason for why the economic structure is such, and the economic structure is not able to do what it's supposed to do in terms of providing upward mobility, decent wages, and so on. It actually has to do with governance, and this is not politics. This is economics in a way, because you see, and I'm trying to borrow a bit from people like Acimoglu, Robinson here. That says actually in an economy, where resources predominates in the production side, fiscal management is not very democratic in a sense. It's not participative, right? A resource-based economy is a very narrow base and based on rents, right? But it does provide monies to the treasury. But monies come from big players, monopolies, right? So it's that you compare that to a fiscal situation where the treasury money depends mostly on tax. If treasury money depend on tax, the governance is more participative, right? Like if 100% of government revenue comes from taxes paid by people of all sorts, then the governance, the oversight of how that money is being spent becomes stronger. But because we live in a regime for the longest time that the treasury doesn't have to depend so much on taxes, but it depends a lot on big taxes paid by big companies as well as rents, basically, that is accrued towards oil and gas and palm oil and so on. So because of that, the governance became very weak, notwithstanding all the nice, beautiful plans that they have. So the governance became very weak, and therefore the oversight on decisions taken by government in terms of what should go first, what should go later, as this does not become very effective. So, and also, in spite of that, the state of fiscal situation actually deteriorated, right? I mean, we got deficits over the last 20 years continuously, but and then to the point there, you raised also the question, Muhammad alluded to it. Now, the government is saying when it comes to a crunch like this, a crisis like this, where we need government to come in and provide a very solid floor, social safety net towards everybody. And then the government saying, actually, we don't have any more money. It's little, what was the term? The limited fiscal space. So this is the problem that we're facing, right? So we have a situation where companies, which are people organize capital to create production, have quite a bit of surpluses in their books. Households are very distinctly divided because household debt to GDP is even higher than government debt to GDP, right? Household debt is about what, 80%? Government debt, Dr. Muhammad said, is about 60-something%. So households are quite indebted, and the government is actually highly indebted. But yet you have an economy that okay, it will register 4 or 5%, whatever it is, but it is not creating the kind of outcome distributionally that we want to see of a country that is developed, matured in that sense. So somehow we have to go back to the issue of how the hell do we revert this? How do we reverse this bad dynamics that we've gotten ourselves into now? So that's where I think the solution has never been, and the problem has never been economics. The problem has been somewhat political in that sense, which is a little bit outside my area of expertise. Well, I was in politics for a bit, but it was my training it doesn't train me in politics. But the problem, I think, is more of governance and politics. If we get the governance issue better, and right now I think is the right time to actually trying to do something, because you need an impetus to do change, and this is as right an impetus that you need, right? Because you have a crisis, huge crisis, and this crisis is saying that, oh, what's going on? Because government doesn't have money, household, a big chunk of them are suffering. So what do we need to do? So I think all this SPV 2030 stuff, they just need to put it aside, Evelyn. I think they just need to rethink that the situation now and the post-COVID situation that's going to happen as we recover from this. I think, God willing, we will recover from this. it's going to be totally different. And not only will it be different, the way policy and public institutions and even private sector is going to react to it has to be totally different, right? It cannot be based on the sort of assumptions, institutional arrangements that existed before. Because even like Muhammad was saying, even the ones that existed before, we knew, and I was making the point that they were not producing the sort of outcome that we would like to see. So we have this opportunity now to rethink things, to put aside all this SPV, whatever SPV 2030. SPV 2030, it seems like a Vision 2020 plus, like Vision 2020 plus 10 years. That's not the kind of thinking that we want. We want something harder now, and we want something that actually addresses this issue of inequality, this issue of oversight and governance, economic oversight and governance. And I think that the real thin edge of the wedge of change is actually, it has to be in the political sphere. The failure that we see in the economic markets, is actually primarily due to failures in the political market. And this is somewhat interlinked. And we have to get our act together, because the world is moving along, for God's sake. We are now like number 6 economy in ASEAN. I grew up knowing that we were number 3 in ASEAN, and now we're number 6 in ASEAN. Everybody has overtaken us. So we need to have a collective sense that some hard decisions need to be made, and economically, but the harder decision, as we are all aware, this last week, that the problem that we're having in this country is actually more economics than anything else. And so I think unless we are able to do that, we will be condemned. This is where I disagree with Dr. Muhammad. We will not be a rich country with poorly distributed riches. We will go the way of Uruguay or Argentina. We will have this very graceful slide, slowly, like somebody having diabetes and kidney problem. You won't die like a heart attack. You will die very slowly, and it will be kind of sad, because people like Prof. Jomo and I, we will leave this world maybe, I don't know, the life expectancy is like 70 something. So, but we'll leave behind the younger people in the audience whose future is longer. So I'll stop at that, Evelyn. Thank you very much. Sorry for the audio thing.
No worries, and thank you, Dr. Nungsari. I think Dr. Nungsari raised a very important question on setting priorities in terms of governance. So relooking or reviewing some of these long-term, the relevance of some of these long-term development plans, especially in the context of the problems in the economy due to COVID-19, apart from the nature of FDI flows, not just the quantity of FDI. And that's a very interesting point, because if you look at recent studies, technical efficiency of foreign firms has been on a drastic decline, implying that productivity gains of foreign firms are no longer new. It's a thing of the past, because the efficiency levels are almost comparable to that of local firms. And that comes through very clearly in recent data from 2014 to 2019. So it's no longer a case of saying that foreign direct investments are more efficient than local investments. So on the issue of governance and policy, can I hand back to Prof. Jomo? Prof. Jomo, please.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and thank you to the previous two speakers as well. I think taking off from Dr. Nung has addressed some of the issues I was about to address earlier, so I'm very much relieved by that. I would simply emphasize that the promise of Vision 2020, Wawasan 2020, in 1991 has never really been fulfilled. Neither have we actually made serious efforts since 1997. And the reasons we all know. But I think it is still worth revisiting. It is far more visionary than anything else we have heard since or before. The reason I say that is that if we think about the new dispensation which came out in 1971, it was very good compared to the previous status quo. But it did not address a number of issues. It did not address where growth, where development was really going to come from. It did not address the importance of technology, of a number of other issues related to that. It did not, and very importantly for our country, because our country, remember, 1971 was still a very new country. Malaysia was only formed in 1963, and Singapore in 1965. So the whole question of Sabah and Sarawak still needs revisiting, and that was not addressed in the Rukun Negara. But Vision 2020 make reference to that. So I think Vision 2020, which I want to emphasize that two of my former colleagues, Ismail Saleh and and Rostam Sani, were very, very crucial in formulating Vision 2020. It is a far more comprehensive view about what the country needs. And following from Vision, that we had slogans such as Malaysia Boleh, which was quite meaningful at that time. We had a lot of South-South cooperation, all of which I think are still very much relevant in the world today. So it inspired a younger generation. Unfortunately, as I said, we have not heard much about it. And even the first proponent of it, Tun Mahathir, whom you just heard, hardly ever mentions it, if at all. So we have a situation where, in a sense, it helps us to address many of the major challenges which we face in the country today. Let me go back to your first question, and the question of fiscal space. I think it's very important to ask ourselves, what do we mean by fiscal space? Who defines fiscal space for us? Fiscal space, unfortunately, has been radically redefined in recent years, recent decades, by the compulsion coming really from financial markets to balance annual budgets. As we know, business cycles are not annual. Business cycles occur over a number of years, and there's always a need to have consistent macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy particularly, which is counter-cyclical. And unfortunately, we do not have that kind of commitment, firm and strong commitment to a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So looking at the annual budget is, in my view, a grossly inadequate way of looking at how to handle macroeconomic stability, how to address the questions of growth in the long run. Now, there are two problems, however, which also need to be mentioned in this context. Firstly, as the late Ismail Saleh pointed out, since the birth of this nation from the 1960s, the impact of the fiscal system, of taxes in particular, has been regressive. We all think that the fiscal tax system is progressive. That is a myth. And Wee Chong Hui and others have shown that this regressiveness continues at least to the first decade of this century, and have absolutely no reason to believe that Najib's regime addressed it in any progressive fashion. So, I'm quite convinced, although I don't have the data with me right now, to assert that the tax system has been regressive. And people like Jacob Meerman and so on have shown from 5 decades ago, even at the height of the relatively progressive new economic policy, in fact, public expenditure was also regressive. So on both sides, as far as the fiscal account is concerned, the system has been regressive. And this, I think, is important for us to address. These are longer-term issues. But in the short term, the second point to make in this connection is the take, particularly from direct taxation, from taxes on income and wealth, has actually gone down relatively. We have seen a significant transition over the last 3.5 decades or so towards a much more reliance on indirect taxation, which basically means consumption taxes, whether SST or GST. It doesn't really matter to me. The fact is that it is essentially not progressive. Okay, and this, I think, is part of the problem right now. And so many people think, oh, we lost a lot of revenue because of the transition to GST. I agree that there was a lot of revenue loss. Some of us actually argued that there was a different kind of transition which could have been achieved, replacing the GST, but with a slightly less regressive VAT. But of course, that is a lost moment which was never pushed through. But the other thing I think to be said in this connection is that the overall taxation has actually gone down. And what we have seen is that the government has been borrowing off budget. And this is very dangerous because it doesn't even go to parliament. So all this so-called government guaranteed borrowings for the so-called GLCs, etc., is off budget. Even the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, does not even know what is going on there. And this, I think, is a very dangerous problem, which has been worsened, particularly since the end of the first decade of this century. So we have to be very, very, there is a great scope, a tremendous scope for fiscal reform, which is necessary. But the immediate question, undoubtedly, there is a problem now. There's very little room for taxes to be augmented in the short term. And my suggestion there would be to push very hard for windfall taxation, and which is basically not sensitive to this. In fact, the fact that some companies have benefited a lot from higher commodity prices or higher prices of some of their exports and so on and so forth, there's absolutely no reason why. And we have had a history of windfall taxation. It is misleading to say that we do not have windfall taxation in this country. It just needs to be much more comprehensive, and that is something which I think nobody really would really quarrel with, of course, except the people who have to pay the tax. Okay. Now but the key question is that we have seen during the period, particularly during an earlier period when Keynesian policy making was much more significant, monetary financing of fiscal deficits. In other words, the central bank can basically borrow to finance the fiscal deficit. And this is something which is to be achieved, okay? I don't want to confuse this issue with the whole question of central bank reserves and so on and so forth, but it's very, very important for us to recognize that this has been done. If you think about what is called MMT in the West, modern monetary theory, if you think about the so-called monetary policies which are still practiced by the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and this is all been done. And if you think about the strong fiscal response to COVID-19, which is currently taking place, this has been enabled precisely by by central bank financing. So this is something which developing countries should be allowed to do. Now, undoubtedly, some of the borrowing cannot be done in this way, especially when you have a foreign exchange constraint. But as far as domestic borrowing, for spending on the domestic economy, it's perfectly legitimate. And especially now, since you have a liquidity crisis, because you have people who are, at least until the lockdown, who are still capable of producing, but you do not have people with the incomes to be able to buy them. And this is precisely why the relief measures should be much more sustained and should be continuous rather than conducted in the way that they have been conducted. Now, it is good, as you know, you work on labor issues that you provide means for labor, especially in the large enterprises. But let's not forget that more than half the economy are people in the informal sector, and those people have got almost no compensation whatsoever beyond what they might get through the latest version of Bantuan Sara Hidup. I don't know what it's called, but this, I think, is very, very important to recognize. So it is not just a question of their survival, it is a question of keeping the economy going. Because you can produce goods, but if there's no demand for the goods, then we are really stuck. You are, from a temporary recession, you are making, the temporary recession is not due to some cataclysmic factor. It is due to very poor handling of the pandemic. And then you worsen the problem by shifting the burden on to people who really are the most vulnerable. The people, a study which Dr. Nong was supervised on demarcating households, it found that the bottom 20% of households in Malaysia, before COVID-19, the bottom 20% basically could not make ends meet. And another 50% or so above that bottom 20%, they basically are not in a position to make significant savings. So when you ask the question of inclusion, obviously all these issues are involved, but the key question I would emphasize is that inclusion is a very misleading slogan. For example, Malaysia has a very high level of financial inclusion. What does that mean? It means that almost every Malaysian household is indebted. That's why we have household levels of indebtedness which are over 80%. So financial inclusion is not necessarily something particularly great, and most is in things like in property, okay, and there is very little available, for example, for a micro enterprise or even small and medium enterprises. The number of small and medium enterprises, Dr. Muhammad has done much more work on this, who are being helped is less than 3%. I think perhaps even less than 2% according to some people. So we are, and that's just SMEs. Forget about the micro enterprises. The only credit they have is from the alongs. Okay, and this is, of course, has other implications which are very problematic. So let me then go back to your fourth and last question, and that is the whole question of economic development policies. Okay, and the problem with the economic development policies in Malaysia especially is that we have lost the impetus which we had in 1991 with Vision 2020. We envisaged a modern economy, a technologically progressive, etc., etc. All that has been lost, and we are basically hoping that somehow foreign direct investment is going to save us from everything. I mean, it is patent nonsense, frankly. Foreign direct investment, speaking, follows domestic investment. If domestic investors have no confidence in an economy, foreign direct investment is not going to come in. Okay, they are going to look at domestic investment. So it is very, very important that we pay far more attention to inducing domestic investment, and particularly there's a lot of rhetoric about small and medium enterprises, but in fact, there's very little actual support. We are much, much more concerned about giving tax breaks to foreign direct investment. And now the world is changing. Janet Yellen has announced that she wants a global corporate income tax level of at least 21%. And unfortunately, the G7 pushed it down to 15%, but that is probably going to go through. Are we still going to rely on tax breaks to attract foreign direct investment, which is what we have been so proud of doing? I mean, look in the famous case of Tanzania. They gave so much incentives to Tanzania that at the end of the day, when people started doing the bookkeeping, they found that actually, guess how much tax the gold mining companies in Tanzania were paying? The answer was negative. It was the government which was subsidizing the gold mining companies, who were laughing all the way to the bank. So we have to put all these things in perspective. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Malaysian economy, and this has been exacerbated by a high level of incompetence a focus on political survival. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Prof. Jomo gave us some views on the scope for fiscal reform, namely the need for counter-cyclical policies and windfall taxes, which is also one of the questions that has come up from one of the participants. So now we will compile questions. What I'll do is I will post in 3 questions for one each for Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Nungsari, and Prof. Jomo. Dr. Muhammad, the question goes like this. What are the key economic or education policies that must be put in place to address huge disparities in income inequality in Malaysia? For Dr. Nungsari, Malaysia has successfully industrialized but faces difficulties in moving towards frontier technologies. What should we do? I think we can combine that with another question on the lack of focus on high potential sectors or high tech sectors. What should we focus on? And Prof. Jomo, there was one you did mention that we should have the windfall tax. So there's one on should Malaysia implement wealth tax and windfall tax? You have mentioned about windfall tax. How can we establish good public-private partnership initiatives in moving forward or addressing the problem of COVID-19? So with that, can I start first with Dr. Muhammad, then Dr. Nungsari, and Prof. Jomo? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll answer the question that you've been posed. First, to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor in inequality, one must first understand what created that gap in the first place. So you can put a mitigating factors. One of the main factors in Malaysia and elsewhere, tax play an important role. And in Malaysia, the sources of earnings are not taxed equally. For instance, if you are a wage earner, you collected 300,000 a year or 100,000 a year, you get tax. But if you get 300,000 in capital gain, you get zero tax. If you get 300,000 from your parents when they're alive or when they're dead, you pay nothing. Or like Dr. Nung and Prof. Jomo mentioned earlier, some people make a lot of money because of COVID. Glove company, for instance, they pay huge dividend. One of the owners made 1.2 billion last year, past 12 months. How much tax he pays? He pays zero tax. There's no tax. So reform in taxation is important prerequisite towards fairer society. It's not about punishing the rich, but it's towards a fair taxation. All sources of tax should be sources of earning should be taxed equally. Education is another factor. Education is a good ladder to move up. But if you switch the policy, if you now, this maybe not sexy to say, if you focus purely on meritocracy, purely on grades, those families or children from well-to-do families are going to do well. Those from low-cost flats who has to share handphones with 3 other siblings, not going to do well. So access to opportunities must take also into account background of socio-economic background. But importantly, on tax, is going to be a huge challenge to introduce reform in taxation, because the inequality is not just in consumption, income, or wealth. Inequality also in the form of voice. Who has the voice to influence politicians, to influence policymakers? Why can't we impose windfall tax? Because the tycoon can walk in the corridor of power, Machikia cannot walk in the corridor of power. And we have our authority who said you cannot impose windfall tax because foreigners will not come in, which is, I thought, is short, is like in history lesson. We have imposed, Prof. Jomo mentioned this, we have imposed windfall tax on palm oil since 1998. And last year we collected, or this year we're going to collect about 1 billion from windfall tax from palm oil. And that's a benchmark. If you palm oil price above 2,500 in Peninsula, 3,000 in Sabah Sarawak, you impose. And that's not the only sector. In IPP, for instance, 2008, they imposed windfall tax of 30% if your return on IPP is above 9%. We already imposed this. And for the government to say that, oh, we cannot impose because we never done it, or it would chase away investor, that's short, that's stupid, I think, and do not understand history. That is the problem. Sometimes the inequality in voice impede our proposed solutions towards more inclusive society. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Nungsari, please.
Now, the hypothesis that we have industrialized, I might want to challenge that a bit, actually. I'm actually from Penang and witnessed the transformation of, especially on the island, but that was partly FDI driven. But what we did not develop was, and I think the IMP, the Industrial Master Plan 2, I think, that actually emphasized this cluster development thing, which was actually a beautiful plan, but that never really happened. You see, since we are a bunch of economic students, so we can talk. You see, what happened was the ecosystem of a cluster where boundaries of firms are formed around lesser activities, but there are more firms doing different activities in the same cluster, right? So what that is a well-developed clusters where the value chain, the activity chain is dispersed over firms, but they group together. So that's what's never happened in MNCs or FDI-driven clusters. They tend to be standalone stuff, and then they can deepen or scale up, but they don't create the cluster effect of forward or backward linkages. And that's why we never really have sufficient roots on industrialization in that sense. Where we have some roots are actually resource-based clusters, whether it is wood to furniture or palm oil to oleochemicals or petroleum and gas to petrochemicals. The domestic based sort of industrial clusters have the sufficient industrial organization dynamics that we could develop on. But the ones that are based on FDI did not really develop the forward and backward linkages to deepen the cluster. And in Penang, I'm looking at it quite a bit. People like, Raja looked at it quite a bit. The reason for that is actually there's this great opportunity, right, for local firms to be part of the backward or forward linkages anchored by these MNCs, but that didn't happen. A lot of it has to do with skills, unfortunately. If you talk to the big companies in Penang, the constraint are actually levels of human capital, and they keep saying that. Then our ministry keeps saying, "Oh, but we have all kinds of unemployed people." So that's one. The other, but all these policies to me, that was 1990s, 2000, 2010 story lah. Now going forward, post-COVID, going forward in the next 10, 15 years, I think the way that we need to do to create more domestic firms, whether it is the question was whether focus on high tech and whatever not. You see, I have this thing about high tech also lah. They call all these companies Google, Amazon, Grab, semua ni high tech, but they don't create that much high-paying jobs. Anyway, they create a lot of low-paying jobs. What going forward, what we should be doing is we should be supporting. I like this article that Raghuram Rajan wrote, former Reserve Bank of India, the governor now, Professor at Chicago. He should build back broader. We should have a more localized, smaller sense of bottoms-up kind of betting on growth. And I think that stands a better chance of mobilizing people and also capital domestically to create new sort of growth. But the thing that needs to happen it's just not there, but it has to be linked to external demand as well. See, unfortunately, if we do things, if firms do things just to cater to domestic demand, given the kinds of income distribution and income levels that we have, then those firms are not going to be able to do the kind of fancy stuff to fulfill standards and whatnot. But this industrial policy that we had in the 70s or 80s, maybe that's not the right thing. I think we should cast our net broader. It should be technology based. It should be people's human capital based. They should be meant mostly for export market to get the pricing at the right level, so the firms make enough profits and therefore employ people and also pay people at the right sort of level of wages, higher than what it is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nong. Prof. Jomo.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me give 2 or 3 quick examples. Okay? Firstly, if we think about, Malaysia is the most efficient refiner of palm oil in the world. And a lot of this was achieved through the economies of scale and scope. But initially, when the transition was happening from the late 1970s, there was a lot of resistance. The Europeans refused to allow Malaysian refined palm oil to get into the market. It was basically essentially protectionist. So this has a very long history. Now, how did this achievement take place? How did it become so efficient? It became so efficient precisely because the Malaysian companies had been taken over. Remember that until the 1970s, the Malaysian companies, big Malaysian plantation companies, were all owned mainly from London. Okay, very few were listed here. And Tun Razak basically began the nationalization of these companies, and that created the conditions. So suddenly you realize that these plantation companies were making a lot of money, but the dividends were just being shared with the shareholders in London. Nothing was coming back here, because they didn't see any more scope, there was no more land available, and so forth. Okay, so what they did instead was to give the shareholder dividends. But what happened after that, when Malaysians realized this, we realized, for example, that rubber price had not gone up after the Korean War boom. And so the transition took place to palm oil, to oil palm, and this was facilitated by the government. And then secondly, after that, the government helped the companies to break into the European to become internationally competitive. Companies were often reluctant, the so-called free rider problem. Nobody wants to invest a lot in breaking into a new market. But it was the government, for example, who started doing deals. I think Tun Mahathir was involved with that. First, a deal with India to sell palm oil to India. Then a deal with Pakistan to sell to Pakistan, and with the Soviet Union and all these countries, and then later the fourth big one was with China. All these countries had foreign exchange problems in those days, after the end of the Bretton Woods system. So they were quite happy to have these so-called barter deals with Malaysia, and that's how, for example, much of the beef which is imported in Malaysia came from India, and so on and so forth. So you see how these kinds of policies, you need a high level of coordination, a high level of competence from the government, an all-of-government approach, which is lacking now, and one which involves interactions with society, but not with specific particular interests. And that's the difference. You basically are trying to help particular companies. So the story is, of course, much more complicated. I won't get into it right now, but I think 2 other examples which are very, very relevant. All over the world, people are now increasingly concerned about global warming. And so there is a great desire to use much more renewable energy. And we have the potential to produce one of the most efficient biodiesels in the world in the form of palm oil. Palm oil is the cheapest vegetable oil on the market already, okay? And it if converted to biodiesel, this could happen. Now, way back in the 1980s, people like Yusuf Basiron and Augustine Ong were already announcing the development of biodiesel. But the government has not done anything to support the development of biodiesel. Indonesia, which is a latecomer in terms of palm oil production and now produces far more palm oil, has already done far more in terms of the biodiesel content in the diesel which is sold at the pump. In Europe, almost all diesel is biodiesel. There's hardly any non-biodiesel which is used in Europe. So you see that, you know, if others can do it, we just don't have the political will. And similarly, I would say that you could do the same thing with the deal with Geely. You know, but if it was a government company, you could negotiate with Geely to get a much better deal to move the proton plant into the next generation, electric vehicles. You know, right now we can't compete with Rayong in Thailand as far as just trying to produce sedans and so on and so forth. We can, looking forward, we can become the place and Geely has the technology, it has access to the technology in terms of battery technology, which is the main stumbling block, and so on and so forth. So there are ways in which you can develop new types of relationships, but you can only do that if you have a government where the public sector, state-owned enterprises, government-linked companies, if you will, are used to develop the leading edges sectors of the economy. Likewise with photovoltaic solar panels. Malaysia is the single largest source of solar panels for the US, as you know, Professor Evelyn Shyamala. You know, and yet almost there's only one Malaysian company among all the producers here. You know, and in fact, the technology is relatively simple. It involves less than 200 components compared to, say, the proton, which involves more than 4,000 components. You know. So it is quite possible if you have the political will, and the technology has not really changed for the last 25 years as far as photovoltaic solar panels are concerned. And it's relatively, you know, it's available. It's very, all the Chinese companies which are investing here are startups from about a decade ago, you know, and we have been calling for this for 2 decades. You know, unfortunately, we just don't, you know, we just have this blind faith that somehow or other foreign direct investment is going to lead us out of everything, you know, and this is the problem. We need to think, but there's no one-size-fits-all solution for PPPs, you know, to make them work. But what we need to do is to have the values and the vision to want to strive to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. There's one general question. What are the most urgent issues to be fixed during this pandemic? So I will link that for Dr. Muhammad. Can you mention some specific or right initiatives to deal adequately with the impoverished communities? Dr. Nungsari, can you highlight some how businesses can be incentivized to improve the quality of investments? What's wrong with our current investment policy or framework? And Prof. Jomo, if you could highlight specific issues related to the current spending of the government on education and healthcare. What needs to be done in those areas. So in moving forward, so I'm tying in the different policy issues for all 3 speakers. We'll start with Dr. Muhammad, please.
Is this our last round? Is there any more questions after this? Do we wrap? You on mute.
We still have quite a number of questions, but we'll stop at 1:30.
Okay.
As per that, we have 10 minutes more here.
Okay, all right. So I don't have to wrap this round. What can we do immediately? What's the pressing issue that can be done? First, you spend to help the rakyat. You spend to help 3 groups. You get the companies so that they don't lay off people. You spend on the self-employed those like Makcik Kia, and you spend on the household, B40 and M40. We are spending too little. For instance, I think just take Makcik Kia. From March last year until now, on average, Makcik Kia self-employed get $2,000 in total. For B40, from last year until now, on average per month, they get 110 ringgit. For M40, since last year until now, they get 44 ringgit. Even for firms, how much do we subsidize firms in terms of wages? Per month, all the workers pekerja dapat gaji lebih kurang 25 to 27 billion every month. Government subsidize on average 1 billion. 1 billion out of 25 is 4%. That's saying, in other words, say imagine I have a company, my wage cost is 100 ringgit. The government said, no, take 4 ringgit, hope you survive, you don't fire people. It's absurd. Singapore subsidized between 25 to 75%. If you're those industries that affected most, tourism, whatever, they subsidize up to 75% of the wage cost. Because the idea is not people to be unemployed, because this also a demand. They buy stuff. If a lot of people unemployed, firms do not do well, we're not gonna do well. So you need to spend immediately so that people can survive and generate the economic activity. That's the most immediate one. I'm not gonna go, but this require somebody who's a bit smarter in running the show. You cannot have those who are arrogant to run the show. And why do I use quite a strong word, arrogant, bongkak? Because when the windfall tax is one, you cannot impose windfall tax, do not under history. Then you say, you cannot do loan moratorium. If you want people to stay at home, do not go out. Makcik Kia cannot go out and do business, earn income, but you don't do loan moratorium, what she's going to do? She has no choice, she has to go out. And your excuse not giving loan moratorium, cannot. We have no power or bank rugi. Two totally wrong justification. So you need somebody who smart, have empathy and honest to do this. And this got to do with, we cannot divorce this from politics. Maybe I'll summarize this towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Nungsari.
Well, businesses, there are many businesses, right? There are smaller businesses who suffered during the pandemic, and then there are big businesses, some of them suffer, but there are also businesses who have lots of, who are benefiting from it, but there are also businesses who have huge surpluses within their balance sheet. So now, so separately, businesses, especially the smaller ones that have suffered because of this 16 months of no business, they need protection, and the protection should be in the form of legislation. And this is why I think this parliament or the government is not doing their work. They should formulate legislation that protects businesses that have contractual obligations, may get kicked out because they haven't been paying rent. So those sort of things. So there should be a proper legislation and not just one of these moral suasion thing. Or kita buat apa moratorium loan, talk to the bank, do a proper legislation to protect these small businesses so that they don't go bankrupt. Because businesses who were okay previously, they should be actually be okay when the demand recovers, especially the smaller ones depend on the domestic demand. But the recourse to help them should be about using legislation vis-a-vis their relationship and liabilities with banks, their relationship and liabilities with counterparties, vendors and so on. So otherwise, they will just go bankrupt. If they go bankrupt, then the unemployment problem will even be worse. Then there's also big business who benefits from it. Then I agree with everybody else here. But we don't have money, so just put bloody windfall profit tax on those guys. And then there's businesses who have fat balance sheets. They might be affected, they might be not affected, but they have huge balance sheets. And this is where what I think all three of us have been trying to say. Part of the reform fiscal reform has to also look on the revenue side. It has to look on the revenue side, and that has to do with taxation reform. I'm a capitalist in the sense that capital needs to be spent. If capital is hoarded, then the capitalist system doesn't work. That's why we need regulation and competition and whatnot. So if firms who has lots and lots of capital within them, and they're just hoarding it and not doing anything, then something ought to be done on the taxation side to make them work. But on the other hand, those who are suffering have to be helped, but it has to be helped from a legislation point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nungsari. Prof. Jomo, please.
Yes, thank you. I cannot help but make this comment. About 12 years ago, Luigi Zingales and Raghuram Rajan wrote a book together about saving capitalism from capitalists. And I think that's a very interesting question, because capitalists often act in their own self-interest, and they do not think very much about saving the entire system. And this is one of the major problems. Ironically, the two of them split up last year when Luigi Zingales came out strongly in favor of stakeholder capitalism versus Raghuram Rajan coming out in favor of Friedman's shareholder capitalism. But anyway, coming back to the question, I think that the healthcare financing is a huge issue which cannot be commented on. But Dr. Muhammad and I were both involved in ensuring that a presentation was made to the previous government to discuss healthcare financing. And what the evidence is very clear, even from a relatively conservative institution such as the World Bank. Adam Wagstaff, who was the main person there who worked on these issues, showed a long time ago, unfortunately he passed away last year, but he showed that the best outcomes, the most efficacious way of financing healthcare is through the budget. Okay, not through so-called social health insurance, or let alone private health insurance. Okay, so the social health insurance system mainly survives in Germany. Okay, and that has a lot to do with the reforms which were introduced over a century ago during Bismarck's time. And even then, in Germany, we see a shift in financing arrangements for public healthcare, increasing towards the government rather than relying on the social health insurance. So, this is something which has been long recognized among people who work on public health economics. But unfortunately, we do most of our public health economic spending, and we send them, where do we send them? We send them to the US to study in US public health schools. So with the US, you basically have a problem where private health insurance is the norm, okay? And it's the only country in which it is the norm, but it is the norm. And then people who teach public health in economics in the US are dealing with this problem. So their solutions are really suboptimal. We have a situation where the expansion which began in the colonial period was really due to the fact that the Anopheles mosquito did not discriminate between white men and brown men, and so everybody was under threat. So public health actually began during the colonial period because Malaya was such a very important and lucrative colony for the British. But since then, the major innovations have been done for relatively low-cost reasons. When Muhammad Said and his wife promoted the idea of bidan kampung in the 1960s and 1970s, if you look at the reduction this is research done by Kazana Research Institute, but the improvements in longevity, life expectancy have really been largely due to the improvements in infant and child mortality as well as maternal mortality. Okay, relatively little, less than 1/4 of it is due to other factors. So we actually do not have a significant improvement, and what is called healthy life expectancy has actually not increased all that significantly, because the period in one's life, even though you're living longer, as Dr. Nung said, you're on an average, I think males live up to about 74 and women live up to an average of 78. So the norm is, I think, around about 76 years. The increase is largely due, the improvement has been largely due to the improvements in child and maternal mortality. So what, and that was due to the simple introduction of Bidan Kampung and accompanying measures. But as Dr. Muhammad knows very, very well, most of the problems, right, if you look at the conditions in low-cost flats and so on and so forth, the situation is abominable. Most of people in urban situations do not have access to clinical support and so on. The so-called Clinic Satu Malaysia, didn't even have doctors. I'm not saying that doctors are so wonderful, but this is a country which has too many doctors now because you allowed private hospitals to every retiring DG and deputy DG was given a private medical school to run. So you basically have an excess number of doctors being trained, and part of the problem we had the other day when the young doctors were having a industrial action was because of that. So we really need to think much more seriously about how to improve the efficacy of health spending, and the way it is not social health insurance and private health insurance are certainly not the way to go. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, make the same silly mistakes which were first introduced during the 1980s and now have become a big problem to haunt us. Public policy should not be made by private insurance companies, and that unfortunately is a real problem which we have in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. This will be our last round of questions. There are some questions that are directed to specific speakers. I will just mention all the questions, and please use this opportunity to also wrap up, are we on the right track? So the first question, I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible, so please bear with us to actually handle these questions. Why are we not focused on long-term innovation and investment in our domestic policies? That's the first. The second one is specifically directed to Dr. Muhammad. Can we print more money during the crisis to help the people? The third one is to Prof. Jomo specifically. Should we increase our minimum wage? And the final question, it's not directed to any specific person. Anyone can jump in. Technocrats are key for coherent economic policies. Do we have that in our bureaucracy? With that, can I start again, sorry, with Dr. Muhammad, and we'll wrap up with your final thoughts on, are we on the right track? Dr. Muhammad?
Okay. Should we print money? And printing money doesn't mean that ching, you go and literal printing. Basically, just transfer in balance sheet. The whole idea is basically to finance all the programs that we mentioned earlier on health, or to help the poor, to help B40, M40, Makcik Kia and businesses. Yes, we can borrow basically to do this. How do we finance this through borrowing, or do we finance to a new income on the revenue side? We discussed this. We have to look at both on the revenue side as well as on the on liability side. The government can borrow, the government can raise funds. For instance, on windfall tax is one. And number two, we lost an important opportunity. Other countries in the world, when they want to do 5G, they auction the spectrum. Thailand collected $3 billion in auctioning the spectrum. We did not do that. Instead, the government have to borrow 11 billion. We give a contract $11 billion bucks. Instead of collecting money by auctioning, now we have to spend 11 billion. It's rather stupid, isn't it? You want to collect money, but instead you do this. To solve this, it's not technocrats, it's not bureaucrats, it's the audience who are listening. It's the young. We cannot allow, or we cannot have the young or the society in particular who condone corruption. and the young have an important role. There's a study done UKM with SPRM. They find 1/3 of 3 university students think it's okay to be corrupt. This is wrong. It's not okay to be corrupt. Why they want to be corrupt? Because they worship a different heroes. Hero worshippers in Malaysia, in particular, have 2 characteristics: feudal in mindset and materialistic, another one. Yeah? And I'm not saying a feudal system. UK has feudal system. European have feudal system. It's feudal mindset is the issue. Feudal towards royals, if I may say, or unelected. Feudal towards agamawan, who actually is a politician, which we cannot argue. And the materialistic side, the hero are those rich and powerful, and which is not right. And supposedly education should tell you or give you a better judgment of values. But we have seen good education, the higher you are, not necessarily the good values that you have. And perfect example is 1MDB. You look at the first, the guy who stole it went to Wharton, Jolo. The first CEO of 1MB went to Stanford. The last CEO of 1MB go to LSE. The board member went to Harvard. All top universities in the world, and they're highly corrupt, and they're not politicians. And the young should not accept, participate in corruption, but also must voice out against this. It was unfortunate that this event is done today. It should be supporting those guys at Dataran Merdeka, Kita Lawan. What they did to the colleagues of the participant. 20-year-old was stripped almost naked, the Sarah girl. The police went and take her from the house in a police car. We should be supporting them. It was unfortunate, like I said, that we have to do this today. So for the young, you cannot be corrupt. You must be berani. And I like to end with this. I think it is extremely important to remember this. It's by Rendra, the famous Indonesian poet. He said, ilmu yang didapati adakah alat untuk penindasan ataupun alat untuk pembebasan? Ilmu. And he said the title of poem is Peringatan untuk Mahasiswa. So there's a role, important role at the moment for the young to not condone this, to be more, to be brave, to voice out. Menulis adalah melawan, bersuara adalah melawan. And otherwise, maybe without that, then we're not going to be on the right track. We'll never be on the right track.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Nong, please.
Now, I have always held the view that the problems that we've had in this country, because an economist, is actually demand-driven. There was a demand failure. If demand signals were correct, then the supply side would respond accordingly. And that's true in markets for goods, market for services, and also market for ideas and market for political market. There's a failure on the demand side. Demand signals, supply should respond. I'm not one of those people who believe supply leads whatever. I'm one who believe demand is the primary side of the equation. And I think I would like to actually concur and actually amplify what Dr. Muhammad says. I think on the political end of things, on society, we who constitute the demand side has failed. I think we've tolerated too much bullshit, too much inefficiency, too much corruption. Then the supply side has gotten the wrong signals. So since 90%, slightly over 90% of this country is made up of people who were born after Merdeka, and people like me, I won't say anything about Madam Chairman, but people like me and Jomo, we are in the less than 10%. So maybe we messed up because over the last 30, 40 years, we were part of the demand side of the equation that actually failed to give the right signals. But the young who are listening today, they are the one who forms the demand side who should give the right signal. They should not be tolerating all kinds of bullshit, corruption, and what Muhammad said. They should be out there, and my heart is actually with those people out there, and who should, and the people listening should be the people who should be very demanding and exacting and uncompromising as part of the demand side of the market, not just in economic sense, but also in the political sense. You don't want to tolerate crappy stuff, right? You pay money, you don't want to get crappy stuff. And that stuff can be, you know, a bowl of laksa. It can also be the elected representative that you elected. So yeah, my thing is actually be part of the. You're already part of the demand. Be honest in signaling the right signals to the supply side. Otherwise, you have to go back and read all these Michael Spence in the literature about signaling and noises in the marketplace. So that will be my parting shot, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I got kicked out for a while. Prof. Jomo, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Firstly, on the question of printing money, I think, you know, let's face it, the West is recovering strongly from the pandemic for two reasons. One, they're getting vaccinated much, much faster. Secondly, because they are spending a lot. Okay? They're spending to get out of this thing. Developing countries as a whole, including countries like Malaysia, which think they are on the cusp of becoming high income, we are doing actually quite poorly because we are not brave enough to spend. You know, now in Malaysia, the problem is compounded by the political mess. So, and people don't trust. Trust is not there because you do not have an all of government approach. You do not have a whole of society approach. So people don't trust. So in this situation, people don't trust that the spending which the government will undertake is going to be particularly good. And look how money has been spent. Look at how the elite, including the political elite, conducts itself. So there's a great number of reasons why people are very, very skeptical. But if we are going to recover from this pandemic, we have to get vaccinate quickly, and secondly, we have to spend. We have to spend. And we have to, of course, I think that we need to think very much in terms of a continuous counter-cyclicality. So once we actually do recover, we increase the revenue collected at that point. But for the time being, the priority is to spend. And so what is called printing money is precisely what the rich countries are doing and precisely what we need to do. But with appropriate checks and balances, because nobody trusts the present government. And it's going to be very difficult to restore trust even if the government changes today. You know? So a second problem, of course, is the whole question, the second issue we raised is the question of wages. You are also a labor economist, and the whole question of measuring productivity, as Dr. Nong reminded us earlier, is actually a very problematic one. Part of the reason why we know that how is productivity measured in the services sector, and the services sector accounts for more employment than all the other sectors put together. Okay, why has productivity in the government sector increased so much, even though the size of the government service has doubled in the last a decade and a half? Why did productivity increase? Why? Because the way we measure productivity is through remuneration. So you pay the workers more, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. In the services sector, it shows up as higher productivity. So what is actually a functional distribution of income or factorial distribution of income passes off as an increase in productivity. You know, the other day I was talking with the former Prime Minister of Turkey, you know, and he increased the minimum wage in Turkey by 30%. Yeah, this is somebody who used to work in Malaysia, Ahmad Daud. Okay? He increased the minimum wage by 30%. And what happened? Inflation went down. It didn't go up, it went down. Okay? Now, there are many reasons why this happened, but you know, it is nonsense to claim this. And the problem in Malaysia, of course, is that we pretend that the foreign workers don't exist. And this is going to be our Achilles heel in dealing with the vaccination. You think that the virus cares what passport you carry? The virus doesn't discriminate on the basis of citizenship. So this is going to be a huge problem. Singapore made this mistake over a year ago and quickly learned. We saw the mistake in Singapore. We thought we were going to fix it, and now we are making the problem even worse. So we are, you know, a lot of our setbacks are own goals. You know, to use a football analogy, you know, we are kicking into our own goal instead of the opponent's goal. This is the problem. So you know, if you don't even, that's why I started off with the joke about, you know, you can be on the right track but going the wrong way. You're kicking in the wrong goal. And that is exactly what is happening here. So I think we really need to change the discourse, and this is why efforts such as this student effort become so important, because you open up the new ways of thinking, you know, and this becomes very important for us to be able to advance our thinking. You know, unfortunately, people are reading less and less. You know, many of these things, what I say now may sound slightly controversial in the Malaysian context, but frankly, all of this is very commonplace abroad. You know, one of the people Dr. Muhammad worked with in Paris, Dr. Francesco Saraceno. Dr. Saraceno just wrote a piece last week, you know, redistributing income and making sure that that despite the recession in the West, that living conditions, working conditions, and so on should not go down. This is all commonplace in the West. It is we in living under our Malaysian tempurung who seem disconnected with all this. So we really need to, you know, what Dr. Muhammad ended with, you know, that you know, be brave when you know, be brave. You know, you speak truth to power. If not, we're not going to make any progress. And that's why I want to commend the organizers for not accepting money and not giving us any money. This is good, because you know, this is where corruption begins. You start accepting money, you know that it's bad. Okay, so I want to thank the organizers for making that decision, and I want to once again thank all of you for your patience, and it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Jomo. I take this opportunity to thank all the three panelists for taking time off and spending your Saturday afternoon to give us those excellent views. I enjoyed listening to all of y'all, and it was really a wealth of knowledge. And I'm sure all the participants agreed with me on this. To all participants, thank you so much for those questions. I tried to be as inclusive as possible and take on all your questions. I'm sorry if I could not take on one or two in the interest of time. To the organizing community, thank you so much for this opportunity to moderate this session. Thank you all, and I hand it over to thank you, Dr. Nung. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I'll hand it back to the organizing committee. I believe they would have some few words to say. Thank you so much. Yeah.